good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm Shinja Kim, President of ICAS, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the ICAS Winter Symposium 2017. This is our first one this year on our ongoing series of the Korean Peninsula issues and the U.S. national security. In today's program, we will focus on the issues in the context of the new administration under Trump and its policies and views on the U.S. and global agenda, the prospects and options on the U.S. and world stages in the face of what's going on all around us. And given the increasingly complex issues and challenges we face in the world we live in today, I'm very pleased with the lineup of our outstanding speakers and discussants who will lead our discussion tackling those issues. So we have 4 speakers in a very compact schedule, and in the interest of time, I'm cutting my program very short today. But just one reminder for those who are new to our proceeding, whom I'm seeing many new faces here today. So ours is not a panel discussion, and each speaker will have 1 hour for his own presentation, and followed by our discussants' comments and Q&As, and the floor will be open to the audience participation. So we have 7 discussants with us today, working with all 4 speakers all throughout the session all day. And so I will introduce those discussants, starting from my immediate left, Joseph Bosco, resident senior associate, CSIS. Dennis Halpin, visiting scholar, Korea Institute, Science, Johns Hopkins University. Peter Hong Kim, Washington correspondent, columnist, Korea Times, Seoul, Korea. And to my right, Larry Nix, senior associate, CSIS. Chen In-bum, visiting scholar, Brookings Institution, Lieutenant General, ROK Army, retired. So with that, let me thank all of you for your interest and participation in this very serious and timely topic of our time. So now we're ready to start with our first speaker, Mr. Michael O'Hanlon, and I will have our moderators who will take us from here. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.
David, you're supposed to introduce him.
Yep.
Come on fast.
Okay.
Good.
Good. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Dr. Kim for this opportunity to introduce our first distinguished speaker today. Dr. Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow in foreign policy, as well as director of research for the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution. He specializes in U.S. defense strategy, the use of military force, and American national security policy. He also co-directs the Center on 21st Century Security and Intelligence. Dr. O'Hanlon is currently an adjunct professor at Columbia, Princeton, and Syracuse Universities, as well as at the University of Denver. He's also a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He was a member of the External Advisory Board of the Central Intelligence Agency from 2011 to 2012, as well as an analyst at the Congressional Budget Office from 1989 to 1994. He's also previously worked at the Institute for Defense Analyses. Dr. O'Hanlon graduated from Princeton University, from which he received a master's degree in engineering, as well as a master's degree and a PhD in public and international affairs, also from Princeton University. Dr. O'Hanlon is also a featured speaker at the ICAS Fall Symposium, and this will be 2015, and this will be his encore appearance before the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael O'Hanlon.
Thank you kindly. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm confident I can keep us on schedule at least, whatever else I may do, because I don't know much about what the Trump administration's Asia policy is. And I think we're all in a position of trying to figure it out, or maybe make some suggestions and discuss the options. And that's what I look forward to the majority of the 60 minutes that we have for this opening topic. So I view my own role as simply putting out a couple of observations, maybe a couple of provocations, and then looking forward to the discussion. I think that if we were to, first of all, look at what has been said and what has been voiced by the Trump administration so far, obviously there are a number of things that have been said along the way. There's been a lot of attention to President Trump's discussion of the two China versus one China issue. There's been a lot of discussion of Korea and missile launches. There have been some nice visits and some golfing expeditions with Prime Minister Abe. There have been various comments about the South China Sea. Let me just mention a couple of these that I think are the most significant so far. First of all, on China policy, you wouldn't necessarily want to recommend that it be made the way it has been made the last 3 months, but we seem to be in an okay place. We seem to be back sort of to more or less steady as she goes on the one China policy, carefulness in how we think about and talk about the Taiwan issue. Obviously, it's still early days. A lot of things could happen. There are a lot of specific questions that will undoubtedly arise. And with the relatively new president still in Taiwan, for example, it's hard to predict what will happen there in terms of Taiwan-China relations. But I think overall in China policy and broad security policy, Mr. Trump has sort of walked back towards something like the previous consensus, where I think Mr. Trump will be more disruptive, and frankly, rightly so, is on the U.S.-China economic relationship. Now, fortunately, in my opinion, he seems to be backing away from some of the more counterproductive ideas for really blowing up the economic relationship. For example, the 45% import tariff idea that was voiced during the campaign, and perhaps even the currency manipulation concept, which is worth keeping on the table. I'm just not sure the evidence suggests that China is currently guilty on that particular charge. But China is guilty of theft of intellectual property rights. China is guilty of having good access to our markets and not granting access to Western or even other neighboring countries' firms. China is having it both ways, benefiting from its role in the international economic order without playing by the rules. Frankly, this was a reason why I was in favor of TPP. I thought TPP was an advantageous way for the rules-compliant part of the international community to raise the standards in their own trade and keep China out until China would comply with similar standards. So I think that actually Secretary Clinton and President Trump were both wrong to make the call they did on TPP, but leave that as it may be. We'll have to see where the trade relationships evolve. There is a case for a much stronger and tougher American approach towards China on the economic front. And one more idea that I'll mention specifically before moving on to a couple other issues is the idea of my colleague David Dollar. And he has suggested that we simply not allow Chinese state-owned companies or firms to buy American assets until the playing field is much more level. And you could imagine a number of other variations on that kind of an idea. Economic ideas that would focus more on future decisions about acquisitions, investments, not so much on disrupting existing economic and trade relationships, where I think you have to be careful because you can easily do more harm to your own economy, even in the interest of trying to better reconcile Chinese behavior with international norms. So that's my quick take on China, and especially on the economic relationship. But let me now talk about the South China Sea, a key related issue. And I think the important things we've seen so far on this question began, in many ways, with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's confirmation hearings, where, as many of you will recall, he was asked about the South China Sea. He was very critical of China's behavior in reclaiming islands and in imposing its way in that general body of water. And on that issue, now Secretary Tillerson was very much within the mainstream of much of American foreign policy thinking. But then he went further, and he said we shouldn't let them militarize these islands. We shouldn't let them continue to have access to these islands. That was a much dicier comment, in my opinion, because it raised the obvious question of how are you going to stop China from accessing these islands, which, by the way, nobody else can rightfully claim except with a couple of cases like the Scarborough Shoal. But in terms of the reclaimed islands, even though China's behavior was assertive, verging on aggressive, it was not, strictly speaking, expansionist or aggressive towards another country. Yes, there were some examples where it had used limited amounts of force in the past in Japan, but in regard to the South China Sea, as I'm sure most of you noticed, he said that he thought these were issues that could be handled diplomatically. Now, I found that a very reassuring comment. Everyone knows Mattis is a tough guy. He's not going to be proposing that we back away from our military commitments. And he's speaking as the head of the Department of Defense, which is expected under President Trump to grow its Navy and probably to further expand its Pacific presence even above and beyond what the Obama administration had done with the so-called rebalance or pivot. So in one sense, Mattis was obviously assuming that military power, American military power, would be a key component, a foundation of American policy towards the region. And yesterday we had General Joseph Dunford at Brookings, and I asked him about this issue, and he reaffirmed in a very calm, steady way that we would of course continue our freedom of navigation activities and other such presence and alliance solidarity activities, if you will, in the broader Western Pacific, including the South China Sea. But Mattis said in his trip a couple of weeks ago, we probably can imagine this problem being solved by diplomatic means. That would imply that we're not going to immediately insist on China pulling any and all military assets from those reclaimed islands, because if we were going to insist on that, diplomacy has arguably already failed, and they're already present. They've already somewhat violated President Xi's promise from the fall of 2015 not to militarize those islands. And now it's a question of how much do they militarize, how do you define the term, how much more can we tolerate? And that's sort of in a way, a more forward-looking conversation. So I think Mattis, to the extent that Tillerson had implied a more assertive American policy of rollback, Mattis essentially took the wind out of that kind of idea, or at least suggested that we would be more patient in how we would pursue that goal. So I saw his script as very calming, and again, I see continuity. I was struck in talking with General Dunford yesterday, by the way, more generally, and as you can imagine, it was a great honor to have him at Brookings and to have this public forum. But a lot of our conversation naturally focused on Russia, Syria, ISIS, the broader Middle East. When China came up, and even North Korea, but especially when China came up, I sensed that there was more of a calmness in the Pentagon and the broader government, that even though we're aware this is a huge historical challenge to deal with China's rise, there was not a sense of urgency to radically change course from where the Obama rebalance had been headed. Others may disagree. I'll put that observation on the table for now. Obviously, there will be a number of things the Trump administration will want to reconsider, including the size of the Navy, the size of the American military presence in the region. But I sense a likelihood of continuity to the first approximation in the first instance anyway. A couple of points on Korea and Japan, and I'll stop. On Korea, we also saw Secretary Mattis go there. We know there are a lot of important and dangerous things happening on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, when Mr. Trump got out his iPhone and tweeted about missile launch at a time that we thought North Korea might be getting ready to launch. In that situation, he said, no, we're not going to let that happen. And that was a little bit worrisome, because even though people like Ash Carter and Bill Perry have articulated that kind of a policy idea before, they didn't do it when they were president of the United States. And it sounded like it was possible that Donald Trump might be considering options like shooting down a North Korean missile on the launch pad, if you literally interpreted his tweet the way it sounded. But once the missile launch actually occurred, during the Mar-a-Lago visit and the golfing weekend with Prime Minister Abe and President Trump a couple weeks ago, then the response was a little bit more muted. And of course, we had a big, internally generated scandal about whether too much national security policy making was being made in an unsecure place in the resort in Florida. But we had much less contentious substantive debate first approximation. We've been through this before with previous presidents. We know there are no great options with North Korean nuclear missile tests. The question really is largely, how can we convince China to put more of a squeeze on North Korea? The assassination of Kim Jong-nam seems to be helping in that regard, gradually reshaping China's own calculus. But I'm not going to predict any major change overnight, certainly. What I think the Trump administration is realizing is that North Korea really is a nasty problem. President Obama counseled President Trump that that was indeed one of the